Some insults are never meant to be heard. Others are never meant to be forgiven. In the middle of the Second World War, with Allied victory still uncertain, one of Britain's most celebrated generals made a remark so reckless it threatened to fracture the alliance holding the war together. He did not shout it from a podium. He did not print it in a newspaper. But he said it clearly enough. American soldiers, he claimed, were useless. What followed was not outrage, not a public rebuke, not an apology demanded in daylight. Instead, Britain's Prime Minister waited. And when he finally spoke, his words revealed far more about power, diplomacy, and wartime survival than the insult itself ever could. This is what Winston Churchill said, after Bernard Montgomery crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. To understand why this moment mattered, you have to understand how fragile the Allied alliance really was. By 1942, Britain could not win the war alone. Its empire was exhausted. Its economy strained. Its army stretched thin across continents. The United States had entered the war late, but with manpower, industry, and confidence unmatched by any nation on earth. The alliance between Britain and America was not built on affection. It was built on need. And nowhere was that tension more visible than among their generals. The relationship between the British and American militaries was complicated from the start. Britain had been fighting for 3 years already. Its soldiers had tasted defeat in France. They had endured the relentless bombing of the Blitz. They had learned war the hard way, through loss, through retreat, through the desperate calculation of survival. American soldiers, by contrast, were entering a war that had already claimed millions. They had training, resources, and confidence. But they did not have experience. They did not yet understand the weight of sustained combat. And to the British officer corps, particularly to those who had already sacrificed so much, this inexperience looked like recklessness. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery believed one thing above all others: wars are won by preparation, not bravado. He despised improvisation. He distrusted speed. He believed casualties were not heroic, they were evidence of failure. This philosophy had shaped his entire military career. Montgomery planned obsessively. He delayed offensives until every variable was controlled. He demanded that his forces be ready, not just armed, but psychologically prepared, strategically positioned, and mathematically superior to their enemies before a single shot was fired. This approach had served him well. At El Alamein, in North Africa, Montgomery had faced Erwin Rommel, one of Nazi Germany's most brilliant and feared commanders. The Afrika Korps was legendary. Their reputation preceded them across every desert and battlefield. But Montgomery did not rush into battle. He took time. He built up his forces. He studied the terrain. He waited until he held every advantage. And when he finally attacked, the result was decisive. Rommel was driven back. The British victory at El Alamein became one of the defining moments of the entire war. Churchill himself said that before El Alamein, they never had a victory. After El Alamein, they never had a defeat. But Montgomery's triumph came with a cost. Victory at El Alamein had been achieved with time, with overwhelming force, with careful preparation. And now Montgomery had to work alongside American commanders who did not think the way he did. General George Patton, General Omar Bradley, and the American command structure operated with a different philosophy. They were aggressive. They were willing to accept casualties if it meant advancing. They believed in momentum and audacity. They believed in moving fast enough to keep the enemy off balance. To Montgomery, these American tactics looked chaotic. When he looked at early American forces in North Africa, inexperienced, aggressive, and prone to mistakes, he saw danger. He saw the possibility of disaster. He saw young Americans getting killed because their commanders did not understand how to wage war properly. And in private conversations, away from official channels, Montgomery voiced his concerns. In harsh moments, He called American troops useless. The word was not spoken once. It was repeated. It was said in officers' clubs. It was mentioned in dispatches that were never meant for the public record. American officers heard it. British officers heard it. The remark circulated through the ranks like a poison. Word spread among soldiers who were already nervous, already questioning whether they belonged on this battleground. American officers felt the sting of disrespect from their supposed allies. The comment was never officially published. It was never officially denied. But it was real, and it was damaging. Eventually, the remark reached the one man who understood exactly how catastrophic this kind of fracture could become. Winston Churchill. The British Prime Minister had not become the leader of his nation by accident. He had survived in politics for decades through an acute understanding of human nature, power dynamics, and the delicate balance required to hold together an alliance under stress. Churchill did not explode. He did not summon Montgomery for a public humiliation. He did not demand an apology broadcast to the world. He understood something that Montgomery, for all his military genius, did not fully grasp. Words between allies can kill wars faster than bullets. Churchill admired Montgomery's victories. El Alamein had saved British honor at a critical moment. The victory had boosted morale across the empire when morale was desperately needed. Montgomery was a national hero. His reputation was unblemished. His track record was impressive. Churchill respected him for this. But Churchill also understood politics, and war, to him, was politics conducted under fire. Nations do not fight wars in isolation. They fight wars in coalition. And coalitions are fragile things, held together not by law or by force, but by trust, by mutual respect, and by the understanding that all parties need each other equally. The United States was no junior partner in this war. It was rapidly becoming the decisive force. American industry was producing weapons, ammunition, and supplies at a scale that Britain could never match. American manpower was flowing across the Atlantic in ever-increasing numbers. American generals were taking on more responsibility. American soldiers were absorbing more of the fighting. The balance of power in the alliance was shifting, and Churchill could see it clearly. To insult American soldiers, to dismiss them as useless, was not just poor diplomatic form. It was strategic suicide. It was a direct threat to the alliance itself. If American soldiers heard that their British allies considered them useless, what would be the psychological impact? If American generals heard that British commanders despised American tactics and American competence, how would that affect cooperation on the battlefield? If President Franklin Roosevelt learned that Montgomery had made such comments, how would that influence his calculations about future cooperation with Britain? Churchill understood that the remark, if allowed to fester and grow, could poison the entire relationship between the two nations at the exact moment when that relationship was most critical. So Churchill did what he always did in moments of crisis. He acted with precision and restraint. He did not confront Montgomery publicly. He did not demand a formal apology. He did not embarrass the man who had just delivered one of Britain's greatest military victories. Instead, he arranged a private meeting. And in that meeting, away from the eyes of the press and the public, he made his position unmistakably clear. Churchill reminded Montgomery that Britain's survival depended on American blood and American steel. Britain could not manufacture enough weapons. Britain could not field enough soldiers. Britain could not sustain the war alone. The Americans were not helping Britain as a favor. The Americans were fighting because they had to, because Nazi Germany threatened their interests, because the world order itself hung in the balance. But that did not make American help any less essential. Britain needed America more than America needed Britain, and everyone in power understood this truth. Churchill then addressed the core issue. The early failures of American forces in North Africa were not proof of inferiority. They were not evidence that American soldiers were fundamentally incapable of fighting effectively. They were the price of entering a war that was already underway. The British had 3 years of experience. The Americans had months. American soldiers would learn. American commanders would adapt. American tactics would evolve. What they needed from their allies was not contempt. They needed support. They needed encouragement. They needed to be treated as partners, not as weaklings who did not belong. And then came the warning. Churchill made it clear that Britain could not afford generals who won battles but endangered alliances. Montgomery could be as brilliant as he wished on the battlefield. He could plan his campaigns with perfect precision. He could achieve every military objective that was set before him. But if he did so while fracturing the relationship with America, he would ultimately undermine the entire war effort. A general who wins battles but loses allies does not win wars. He loses wars. And Britain could not afford that price. The message was clear. Further remarks of that kind would not be tolerated. Not because they were impolite. Not because they hurt American feelings. But because they were dangerous. They were dangerous to the alliance. They were dangerous to the war effort. They were dangerous to Britain's ultimate victory and survival. Montgomery never fully apologized for his remark. He was too proud for that. His ego was too substantial. But he understood the message. He understood that Churchill was not threatening him directly, but rather making clear the consequences of his actions. Montgomery was a brilliant general, but he was not indispensable. If he continued to undermine the American alliance, he could be removed. Churchill had removed generals before. He would do it again if necessary. What makes this moment in history so remarkable is what happened next. The tension did not explode into public scandal. There was no dramatic confrontation. Instead, the situation was managed. Montgomery continued to serve. His military career continued. But something had changed. He became more careful with his words. He became more conscious of the need to maintain the alliance. And crucially, American generals began to take on more authority and responsibility in the theater of operations. The irony that history remembers is this: those same American forces that Montgomery had dismissed as useless would go on to accomplish extraordinary feats. At Normandy, American soldiers would land on beaches under withering fire and establish a foothold in Nazi-occupied Europe. American forces would advance across France with speed and audacity that would have horrified Montgomery in his careful planning phases. American soldiers would fight in the Ardennes, in the Rhineland, and deep into Germany itself. They would absorb casualties at a scale that was beyond anything the British forces could have endured. They would sustain supply lines that stretched across entire continents. They would take on the primary burden of the ground war in Europe. By 1944, the balance had shifted completely. British generals advised. American generals commanded. General Dwight Eisenhower was the supreme commander of the Allied forces. Montgomery served under him as a capable lieutenant. This was not a demotion in terms of military rank. Montgomery was still a field marshal. But it was a demotion in terms of influence and authority. Montgomery had to accept orders from American generals. He had to coordinate his operations with American strategy. He had to acknowledge that the Americans, for all their perceived inexperience, were now the decisive force in the war. Montgomery struggled with this change. His pride was wounded. His ego was bruised. He believed that British caution and British military discipline were superior to American audacity. He was not entirely wrong. In many specific tactical situations, Montgomery's approach would have resulted in fewer casualties. But the war was not a series of individual tactical situations. It was a vast strategic struggle that required momentum, speed, and the willingness to accept losses in pursuit of larger objectives. The Americans understood this. And in the end, the American approach, for all its risks and its terrible costs, won the war. Why did Churchill's words matter so much? On the surface, they seem like a simple warning. A prime minister telling a general to stop insulting the Americans. It sounds almost mundane when described in those terms. But what Churchill actually did was far more significant. He defended reality. He explained that the war would not be won by national ego or by the supremacy of one nation's military philosophy over another's. It would be won by cooperation between unequal partners. It would be won by different nations, with different traditions and different approaches, finding a way to work together toward a common goal. Montgomery was a brilliant battlefield commander. His victories were real. His strategic insights were often correct. His belief in preparation and in minimizing casualties was not foolish. It was an honest military philosophy, one that had proven effective. But Churchill understood something deeper. He understood that in war, relationships matter more than individual battles. He understood that trust between allies is more valuable than tactical precision. He understood that a general who alienates his partners, no matter how many battles he wins, is ultimately defeated. Churchill had learned this lesson through decades of political experience. He had seen alliances form and collapse. He had seen nations united by necessity fracture over personality clashes and wounded pride. He had lived through the First World War, when coordination between British, French, and other Allied forces was often painfully difficult. He knew that the Second World War could be lost not in battle, but in the breakdown of the alliance that held the Axis powers at bay. The message Churchill sent to Montgomery was therefore a profound one. It was not just about Montgomery's careless remarks about American soldiers. It was about the nature of leadership in wartime. It was about understanding that wars are not won by the brilliance of individual commanders, but by the coherence and unity of the alliance fighting the war. A general who understands tactics but not strategy is merely a skilled subordinate. A general who understands strategy but not alliance dynamics is a danger to the entire war effort. Montgomery had to learn to be both. In the months and years that followed, Montgomery did learn this lesson, though imperfectly. He remained proud. He remained convinced of his own military superiority. But he became more careful. He worked more cooperatively with American commanders. He accepted the reality of American authority. And when the war ended and the Allies emerged victorious, Montgomery was there as one of the victors, even if his role had diminished and his glory was somewhat shared. Churchill's response to Montgomery's careless remarks about American soldiers became a template for how to handle alliance crises without allowing them to become public scandals. It demonstrated that strong leadership in wartime is not about bold, dramatic gestures. It is about understanding the dynamics of power, about recognizing what truly matters versus what merely seems important, and about having the wisdom to address problems quietly and firmly rather than loudly and publicly. The remark about American soldiers being useless was never formally addressed in any official document. It was never mentioned in dispatches. It was not included in the official records. But everyone who needed to know about Churchill's response understood the message. And that understanding shaped the course of the war in subtle but important ways. After the war, as historians have examined the relationship between Churchill and Montgomery, between Britain and America, between British and American military philosophy, they have recognized this moment as a turning point. This was the moment when Britain's role as the dominant partner in the alliance formally ended. This was the moment when America began its ascent to leadership of the Western world. And this was the moment when the alliance survived its greatest internal threat, not through confrontation, but through quiet, firm, intelligent diplomacy. Montgomery's dismissal of American troops had been born from fear and from pride. He feared that American inexperience would lead to disaster. He was proud of British achievements and British military tradition. These were not entirely illegitimate feelings. But they were dangerous in the context of an alliance, and Churchill understood this. By addressing the issue directly but privately, Churchill prevented Montgomery's fears and pride from poisoning the larger relationship. What makes this story so relevant, even today, is what it tells us about leadership and about the nature of alliances. Nations do not cooperate because they love each other. They cooperate because they need each other. And that cooperation is fragile. It can be destroyed by careless words, by wounded pride, by the assertion of national superiority. But it can also be protected by leaders who understand that their role is not to win every argument or to prove every point, but to hold the alliance together long enough to achieve the common objective. Churchill did not need to humiliate Montgomery. Churchill did not need to prove that American soldiers were capable and brave. Churchill did not need to launch a public campaign to defend American honor. Instead, he simply made clear to Montgomery that such behavior was incompatible with continuing in his role. This was sufficient. This was leadership of the highest order. The war ended in 1945 with the defeat of Nazi Germany and the surrender of Japan. Britain and America had fought together as allies for nearly 4 years. There had been friction and disagreement. There had been moments of real tension. But the alliance had held. The reasons it held were complex and multifaceted. But among those reasons was the quiet leadership of Winston Churchill, who understood that in wartime, protecting the alliance is as important as winning battles. Montgomery's dismissal of American troops faded from the historical record. It was never widely publicized. Most people never even heard about it. But Churchill's response to that dismissal shaped the course of the war and the future of the Western Alliance. Churchill chose restraint over confrontation. He chose alliance over ego. He chose survival over pride. And in doing so, he demonstrated the kind of wisdom that separates great leaders from merely competent ones. The lesson that echoes through history is this: wars are not lost on battlefields alone. They are lost in the relationships between allies, in the breakdown of trust, in the accumulation of resentments and wounded pride. A general who can command troops but cannot cooperate with allies is ultimately more dangerous than useful. A leader who can win battles but cannot maintain alliances has not truly won anything that will last. Winston Churchill understood this. Bernard Montgomery, brilliant as he was, had to be reminded of it. And in that reminder, delivered quietly, firmly, and with absolute clarity, Churchill demonstrated why he was remembered as one of the greatest leaders of the 20th century. He did not seek glory for himself. He did not demand public apologies or dramatic gestures. He simply did what was necessary to preserve the alliance and continue the war to victory. Because in war, the most dangerous weapons are not tanks or bombs or artillery. The most dangerous weapons are words spoken carelessly between men who must stand together or fall separately. Churchill understood this truth. He lived this truth. And he taught this truth to those around him, whether they wanted to learn it or not. The relationship between Britain and America would continue to evolve over the decades that followed. America would become the undisputed leader of the Western world. Britain would gradually transition from empire to kingdom. But that transition was smoother, and the partnership was stronger, because Churchill had understood the nature of alliances and had been willing to address crises quietly and decisively. Montgomery survived the war. He was celebrated as a great general. But he is remembered by historians not just for his victories, but for the lesson he learned about working with allies. Churchill survived the war and was remembered as the leader who held the alliance together through the darkest hours. History gave Churchill the greater accolade, even though Montgomery won more battles, because history understands that holding an alliance together in the face of existential threat is the greater accomplishment. So when we remember what Churchill said after Montgomery called American soldiers useless, we are remembering far more than a moment of diplomatic correction. We are remembering a lesson about leadership, about alliance management, about the understanding that wars are won not by individual brilliance but by coordinated effort. We are remembering the quiet wisdom of a great leader who knew that sometimes the most powerful words are spoken in private to an audience of one, and that sometimes the greatest victories are achieved not in battle but in the preservation of unity and trust between allies who must together face their enemies. This is the story that history has preserved, Not the insult itself, but the response to it. Not the moment of friction, but the moment when friction was transformed into clarity and understanding. Not the words that threatened to destroy an alliance, but the words that saved it. Because that is what great leadership looks like. That is what wisdom looks like. That is how wars are truly won.